Story 1. The Midnight Break-In. It began in the kind of quiet you only hear in the early hours of the morning, when the hum of the refrigerator is the loudest thing in the house, and every creak in the floorboard sounds like it's announcing itself to the world. On the night of June 14th, 2018, in a modest single-story home in the small town of Calibiot, Mississippi, that quiet was broken not by a scream, not by a crash, but by the slow, deliberate sound of a door latch being manipulated from the outside. You've probably never heard that sound in your own home, and hopefully you never will. It's a combination of metal clicking and wood shifting, subtle enough to be mistaken for a gust of wind unless you're awake. Inside the home was 64-year-old Dorothy Hammond, a retired school librarian who had lived alone since her husband's passing 4 years earlier. Dorothy was known in the community for her nightly routines: a cup of chamomile tea at 9 p.m., lights out at 10, and the bedroom window cracked open to let the good air in, as she put it. But that night, she wasn't asleep. She was lying in bed, wide-eyed, in the kind of restless state where you're alert to every detail. That's when she heard the latch. The neighborhood and the pattern. Calibiot isn't the kind of place where people expect crime to happen. It's the sort of town where front doors are often left unlocked and people wave to each other when passing in cars. But over the past month, a quiet unease had been building. 3 homes, each about a mile apart, had been broken into. The burglaries had strange similarities. No broken windows or forced doors. Only small, easy-to-carry items taken: cash, jewelry, small electronics. No sign that the intruder had searched for valuables in obvious places. Instead, they seemed to know exactly where to look. The sheriff's department had little to go on. The stolen items were too generic to trace, and there were no eyewitnesses. Most unsettling of all, each break-in happened between 1 a.m. and 3 a.m. when residents were home and asleep. Some people began locking their doors for the first time in years. Others simply assumed it was someone passing through and would stop. Dorothy had thought about it too. In fact, the possibility of a break-in had been on her mind just before she turned off the lights that night. The decision to stay still. When Dorothy heard the latch, her first instinct was to grab the phone on her nightstand. But then she stopped. She realized something strange. If she called 911 right away and the person left before police arrived, there'd be no proof. Dorothy wasn't reckless, she was deliberate. Years of working in a library had given her a certain patience, the kind that let her read subtle cues and wait for the right moment to act. She decided that if the intruder thought she was asleep, she might learn more than if she scared them off right away. So she stayed in bed, motionless, eyes closed. The door to her home opened. Footsteps and details. You might think that hearing someone in your home at night would be loud. It's not. It's deliberate, quiet. Footsteps spaced apart as though each one is planned in advance. Dorothy would later describe it to investigators as the sound of someone counting in their head. The intruder didn't turn on the lights. Instead, a faint beam moved across the walls, the kind of light from a small flashlight. Dorothy could tell it was being held low, aimed toward the floor, avoiding direct eye level. Whoever was in her home had done this before. From the direction of the sound, the person entered her living room first. She heard the faint click of a drawer opening, the one she kept under the coffee table. It was where she stored loose change and the occasional $10 bill. A pause, then another drawer, then footsteps toward the kitchen. Dorothy's mind was racing. She was cataloging the movements, the order of rooms, the sound of the person's breathing. A key clue in the hallway. The person didn't just move randomly. They moved toward specific spots where Dorothy had kept valuables in the past, before she'd moved them. One of those spots was a small wooden jewelry box in the hallway cabinet. Dorothy had moved it months earlier, but the intruder went there directly. That meant something important. This wasn't a random burglar. This was someone who had been inside her home before or had been told exactly where to look. It's here where Dorothy realized the danger. If the intruder had been in her home before, they might also know she lived alone. The bedroom approach. When the sound of footsteps turned toward the bedroom, Dorothy slowed her breathing. The flashlight beam appeared faintly on the wall near her dresser. A shadow followed. She could hear the light tap of fingers on the wooden surface, checking for loose change or keys. Then closer footsteps. The intruder stood in the doorway. Dorothy could sense the pause in their movement, the way someone might look to confirm a detail. She thought for a moment they might leave, but instead the footsteps came farther into the room. She could smell something faint, cheap cologne, the kind you'd find at a gas station. Later, she'd remember this detail vividly. The risky move. The burglar leaned close to her nightstand. Dorothy felt the faint displacement of air. She heard the drawer open, a hand shifting inside. Her wallet was there. The drawer closed slowly. The footsteps retreated toward the hallway. At that moment, Dorothy made a decision she hadn't planned. She opened her eyes, just a fraction, enough to see the person's silhouette in the dim beam of the flashlight. She didn't recognize the face, but she saw something, a detail that would later become critical, a distinctive tear in the left sleeve of a dark hoodie. The intruder moved back toward the kitchen. The door clicked shut. The immediate aftermath. Dorothy waited a full minute before moving. She picked up the phone, called the sheriff's office, and described everything she'd heard and seen. Her description was detailed. Male, medium build, maybe 58 to 510. Dark hoodie with a torn left sleeve. Smelled strongly of gas station type cologne. Moved deliberately, seemed to know the layout of the house. Deputies arrived within 12 minutes. They found the front door latch had been tampered with but not broken. A small screwdriver was left on the porch, a tool the burglar had likely used and dropped when leaving. The odd part, there were no fingerprints on it. The pattern deepens. When detectives compared Dorothy's account with the 3 other recent break-ins, the similarities were striking. One of the other victims also mentioned smelling cheap cologne. Another had noticed that drawers containing valuables were opened, but other parts of the home were left untouched. But Dorothy's case gave them something new, a physical description and a clothing detail. The torn sleeve. An unsettling possibility. One detective raised a question that changed the direction of the investigation. If the burglar knew exactly where to look in Dorothy's home, could it be someone who'd been there for a legitimate reason before? A repairman, a delivery driver, a family acquaintance. They began pulling records, work orders, delivery logs, even local contractors. The process would take time, but the search was already narrowing. Dorothy, meanwhile, couldn't shake the thought of the moment in her bedroom, the shadow, the cologne, the deliberate movements. She had pretended to be asleep, but the truth was, she didn't know if the intruder had believed it. And that's where the case sat, in a state of uneasy anticipation. A partial description, a handful of similarities, and one glaring question: was the burglar someone she already knew? Dorothy's description of the burglar, the torn hoodie sleeve, the smell of cologne, the methodical searching gave deputies more than they'd had in weeks. But in small-town investigations, more doesn't always mean enough. There were no fingerprints on the screwdriver found at the scene. The door latch had only faint scratch marks, not deep enough to be distinctive. And without security cameras, the evidence was limited to Dorothy's memory, precise, but still just a witness account. Still, Sheriff's Deputy Alan Morris believed there was one detail that could crack it: the burglar's familiarity with the home. The home visits list. The morning after the break-in, Morris asked Dorothy to make a list. Not just friends or family, but anyone who had been inside her home in the last 2 years. It was longer than you might expect. a local plumber who fixed her bathroom leak, a delivery driver who had dropped off furniture, 2 volunteers from the church who helped clean her gutters, an exterminator who had done a seasonal pest check, a cable company technician who installed a new modem. At the bottom of the list, Dorothy hesitated. Then she added another name, a young man who had stopped by 3 months ago, offering to mow her lawn for cash. She hadn't hired him, but she remembered he'd stepped inside briefly to get a drink of water before leaving. Narrowing the field. Morris ran background checks. Most were clean. A few had minor traffic violations, but one stood out. Kyle J. Renner, 27 years old, minor criminal record for petty theft, last known address in the next county over. Renner had been arrested twice for burglary, both times in situations where the victims had previously interacted with him. In one case, he'd installed a ceiling fan. In another, he'd repaired a back door. The pattern was eerily similar. He'd return weeks later to steal small valuables. And according to employment records, Renner had recently been doing odd jobs around Calibiot. The torn sleeve connection. A quiet break came from an unexpected place. While detectives were checking pawn shops for Dorothy's stolen wallet, unlikely, but worth trying, an employee at a convenience store mentioned a regular customer who matched the burglar's description. The customer, Kyle Renner. The detail that caught attention: he often wore a black hoodie, one with a noticeable tear on the left sleeve. The store's security footage confirmed it. Building the case. But in law enforcement, suspicion isn't enough. They needed evidence linking Renner to Dorothy's home. Morris began surveillance, not the Hollywood kind with unmarked vans and elaborate disguises, but small-town surveillance, parking down the street, noting comings and goings, recording license plates. For 3 nights, nothing happened. Renner worked odd hours at a tire shop in the neighboring county and spent most evenings at a small rental house with a roommate. Then, on the 4th night, a deputy following him saw something unusual. Renner parked 2 streets over from an unlit home, stayed in the car for several minutes, then drove away slowly. The break-in stakeout. The sheriff's department decided to stage a controlled surveillance. They identified a pattern. The recent burglaries had occurred on Tuesday or Wednesday nights, usually between 1:00 a.m. and 3:00 a.m. On the next Wednesday, 2 deputies positioned themselves in unmarked vehicles near Dorothy's neighborhood. Another was placed near the most recent burglary site, half a mile away. It was after 2:00 a.m. when headlights appeared, a silver sedan, matching Renner's vehicle, rolling slowly past Dorothy's street. The car didn't stop. It looped around the block twice, then disappeared into the dark. The deputies didn't follow. They didn't want to spook him, but the observation added weight to the theory that Renner was scouting. The twist: another victim. Just 2 nights later, before they could plan another stakeout, a 4th burglary was reported. This one was different. The victim, 82-year-old Harold Jenkins, woke to find a man in his kitchen rifling through drawers. Harold yelled, and the burglar fled out the back door. But in his haste, the intruder left something behind: a small keychain flashlight. The flashlight was tested. No fingerprints, but the batteries inside. They had a faint smudge of dried cologne on the casing, the same type Dorothy had described. Laying the trap. Detectives decided to try something new. A controlled opportunity operation. They arranged for a deputy, posing as a homeowner, to work outside a property in town with a visible toolbox, pretending to repair a door lock. Within an hour, Renner's car drove past twice. On the 3rd pass, it slowed almost to a stop. The deputy didn't make a move. It wasn't enough yet, but they now had time-stamped vehicle sightings linking Renner to at least 2 areas where burglaries had occurred. A quiet visit. The final step was the riskiest. Dorothy agreed to let deputies install a small, motion-activated camera inside her front hallway, hidden in a decorative vase near the door. For 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then on July 3rd at 1:42 a.m., the camera clicked to life. A shadow moved through the front door. No flashlight this time, just the faint silhouette of a man in a dark hoodie. As he stepped into the hallway, the tear in the left sleeve was visible. He moved exactly as Dorothy had described, deliberate, unhurried, checking specific drawers. The unexpected moment. But halfway through the recording, something happened the deputies hadn't predicted. The man stopped in the hallway and looked directly toward the vase. The footage froze briefly as his face came into partial view. He tilted his head, as though sensing something was off. Then, without touching anything else, he left the house. When deputies reviewed the footage, the partial face was enough for an ID, but it left them with a troubling question. Had Renner recognized the camera, or had he realized something else, something that made him leave without finishing? The sheriff's department had just enough for a warrant, but Dorothy couldn't shake the feeling that the man hadn't left out of fear of getting caught. It felt like he'd left because he'd found what he was looking for. The morning after the camera caught him, Dorothy's home felt different. The door was intact, nothing had been taken, and yet she sensed that something irreversible had happened. The quiet had been disturbed for good. Sheriff's deputies didn't waste time. The partial facial image from the hallway camera, paired with the hoodie and torn sleeve, was enough to present to a judge. By noon, they had a search warrant for Kyle Renner's residence. The search. Renner lived in a rented duplex on the edge of a gravel road, just outside town. The house was small, one floor, peeling paint, a carport with an oil-stained concrete floor. His silver sedan sat parked in front, the hood warm from a recent drive. When deputies entered, they found the front room sparse, a sagging couch, an unplugged television, and stacks of old magazines. But in the bedroom, the picture changed. A large plastic bin sat under the bed. Inside, they found jewelry matching descriptions from 2 previous burglaries, a wallet containing Dorothy's ID and bank cards, cash missing, a small, screwdriver-shaped key tool, similar to the one found on Dorothy's porch. On a shelf above his dresser sat a row of gas station brand cologne bottles. But there was something else, something deputies weren't expecting. A spiral-bound notebook, worn at the edges, with pages filled with handwritten lists. Each page had a different address at the top, followed by bullet points. Living room coffee table drawer. Kitchen jar on shelf. Bedroom second dresser drawer. The notes read like a map to people's homes. The origin of the lists. Renner didn't speak during the search, other than to request a lawyer. It was only later, in interviews with acquaintances, that detectives learned how the lists had been made. Renner had taken odd jobs, yard work, deliveries, handyman repairs for nearly a year in small towns across 2 counties. While inside people's homes, he'd casually note the locations of valuables. He'd jot them down later, intending to come back when the timing was right. He wasn't interested in large hauls. The pattern was consistent: small items that wouldn't immediately be missed, taken quickly without ransacking the home. It was the precision of the thefts that had kept him undetected for so long. The evidence ties together. Dorothy's home was one of the addresses in the notebook, her name written in block letters, with the hallway jewelry box and nightstand listed as target points. The torn sleeve hoodie was also found in his closet. Pawn shop records placed Renner there within 48 hours of 2 earlier burglaries. And while he'd been careful to avoid using his real name, security camera stills matched his appearance. Forensic testing on the screwdriver found at Dorothy's porch revealed microscopic fabric fibers consistent with gloves found in Renner's car. The case was no longer circumstantial, it was airtight. The trial. Renner was charged with multiple counts of burglary, possession of stolen property, and attempted burglary for his second visit to Dorothy's home. His defense attorney argued that the hallway camera's footage was too grainy for a positive ID, but the notebook, the recovered items, and the pawn shop footage painted a different picture. Dorothy testified calmly. She described the night of the break-in in detail: the sound of the latch, the smell of cologne, the deliberate footsteps. She even explained why she had pretended to be asleep. "If I had moved, he might have run, and then we'd all still be wondering who was out there, walking into our homes." The jury deliberated for just under 3 hours. The verdict: guilty on all counts. Renner was sentenced to 12 years in state prison. What he took that night. There was still one detail Dorothy couldn't let go of. On the second visit, the night the camera caught him, Renner had left without taking anything obvious. When detectives pressed him after sentencing, he didn't admit to much, but he did say one thing: "I already had what I came for the first time. The second time was just to make sure." No one could confirm what he meant. Some believe he'd been looking for a particular item, maybe a hidden stash of cash or a document. Others think he came back simply to check if she'd noticed the theft. The truth, like many details in low-profile crimes, may never be known. The impact on Collibiot. In the months after Renner's arrest, the break-in stopped. People began to relax again, but habits had changed. Locks were used more often. Security cameras popped up on porches. And for the first time in decades, the local hardware store sold out of heavy-duty deadbolts. Dorothy went back to her quiet routines, though she no longer left her window open at night. She still drinks chamomile tea before bed, still keeps the hallway light off, but now she checks the latch twice before turning in. She doesn't call herself brave. She says she just waited and listened. But in doing so, she provided the one clue that unraveled an entire pattern of crimes. And in that still, calculated choice to pretend to be asleep, she reminded investigators of something simple but vital. Sometimes, the key to catching a criminal isn't confrontation, it's observation. Yet the unanswered question lingers. If Renner hadn't been caught, how many more names would he have added to that notebook? Story 2. The grocery store ledger. In the world of retail, theft usually brings to mind images of shoplifters slipping items into bags, or cashiers pocketing bills when the registers open. But sometimes, theft doesn't involve sneaking anything out the door. Sometimes, it's about making the numbers look right even when they are. In the small town of Mineral Ridge, Ohio, the Matthews & Sons grocery store had been a community fixture for over 40 years. People came not just for bread and milk, but for small-town rituals, chatting at the deli counter, reading the corkboard for local job postings, picking up the Sunday paper from the same bin they'd used as kids. The store's books, like its traditions, were supposed to be simple, but over the course of nearly a decade, they were quietly rewritten line by someone who understood them better than anyone else. The routine that hid the crime. In 2016, the store's owner, Richard Matthews, decided to modernize the business. He purchased a new accounting software system that could integrate directly with point-of-sale registers. It was supposed to make the end-of-month reconciliations quicker. His head cashier, Carol Bentley, was the first to be trained on the new system. Carol had been with the store for 22 years, long enough to see 3 different generations of Matthews family members take turns managing it. She was known for being meticulous, the kind of person who balanced her own checkbook to the penny every Sunday afternoon. When the system launched, things ran smoothly, or so it seemed. Sales totals matched, invoices cleared, and profit margins held steady. Richard didn't see any reason to double-check her work. The first hint. It wasn't an audit or a missing shipment that raised suspicion. It was a loaf of bread. In early 2019, A junior assistant manager named Evan noticed a small discrepancy on the bread vendor's delivery receipt. The paper invoice said they'd received 62 loaves. The store's software said 58. It was only a $6 difference, and he assumed it was a me-scan at the register. But when he mentioned it casually to another employee, they said, that happens a lot." That small comment planted the seed. The pattern in the paper trail. Over the next 2 weeks, Evan began checking incoming deliveries against what was recorded in the store's system. The mismatches weren't big, never more than $10 or $15 at a time, but they were consistent, and always in the same direction. Fewer items recorded in the books than were actually delivered. The difference in cost wasn't alarming enough to trigger red flags in the owner's monthly reports, but over a year, those little gaps could add up. Evan brought it to Richard's attention. Richard's reaction was mixed, partly appreciative, partly dismissive. He knew retail margins were thin and vendor errors happened, but Evan insisted that the mismatches weren't random. They were selective. The adjustment entries. Richard decided to dig into the software logs himself. That's when he noticed something he'd never looked at before: the adjustment column. This was where inventory counts could be manually changed. For example, if a jar of pasta sauce broke in the stockroom and needed to be removed from the count. But here what stood out: nearly all of the adjustments were entered by the same user login, Carol Bentley's, and they happened almost exclusively in the early morning, before the store opened, when she was often there alone, doing administrative work. Testing the theory. Richard didn't want to accuse a 22-year veteran without proof, so he devised a quiet test. On a Tuesday night, after the store closed, he and Evan counted the exact quantities of 3 random items: loaves of rye bread, bottles of store-brand dish soap, packages of shredded cheddar cheese. They wrote down the numbers privately, without entering them into the system. The next morning, when Richard checked the software logs from home, 2 of the 3 items had been adjusted, lowered by 3 to 5 units each. Following the money. Lowering the recorded inventory numbers alone wouldn't be enough to steal from the store. The missing product had to go somewhere. That somewhere, they suspected, was cash. If the store system showed fewer items received, the cost to the store looked lower on paper. When those extra items sold, the money from those sales could be skimmed from the register without leaving a trace in the books. It was a simple scheme, one that depended on small amounts stolen repeatedly over time, staying well below the radar. The scope becomes clear. Richard asked a local CPA to quietly review 3 years of records. The estimate was sobering. The store had likely lost between $48,000 and $55,000 through this method. It hadn't crippled the business. The losses were spread out over so many small transactions that they were absorbed into operating costs, but it had been happening right under his nose. And the person responsible wasn't some anonymous hacker. It was someone he trusted with the store keys. Setting the trap. Rather than confronting Carol outright, Richard contacted the Mineral Ridge Police Department. Detective Laura Gaines, who specialized in financial crimes, suggested they run a controlled operation. They picked a single delivery, a Wednesday morning produce shipment, and pre-marked a selection of items with invisible UV pen ink. The numbers were recorded accurately in the system, without adjustments. Then they waited. When the shipment sold, the cash from those items should match exactly with the register totals. If it didn't, there'd be only one explanation. 2 days later, the discrepancy appeared. The UV-marked items had sold, but the cash they generated wasn't in the drawer. Detective Gaines had seen this pattern before. She told Richard, "This isn't just a side habit. This is a system she's been running for years." And yet, as they prepared to move in on Carol, a deeper question arose. Was she working alone? Detective Laura Gaines knew that catching someone in a long-running financial theft wasn't about catching them in the act, once it was about showing consistency. One missing sum could be explained away. 10 years of precision theft could not. Her plan was simple: follow the paper trail while quietly monitoring Carol's movements. The grocery store might not have high-tech security, but in 2019, even small businesses had digital footprints. Watching the morning routine. Carol's workday always began the same way. 6:45 a.m. Pull into the employee lot in her blue Ford Taurus. 6:50 a.m. Unlock the store, disarm the alarm. 6:55 a.m. Head straight to the office in the back, coffee cup in hand. 7:05 a.m. Log into the inventory system. From that moment until the first employees arrived at 7:45, she had complete privacy in the store. Detective Gaines arranged for a small pinhole camera to be installed in the office's corner, hidden inside an old smoke detector that no longer functioned. The feed went to a recorder in Richard Matthews' locked desk drawer. The first week's footage. By the end of the first week, they had their first recorded adjustment. Carol sat at the desk, papers in neat stacks beside her, and typed calmly into the computer. She clicked into the adjustment column, changed a delivery count from 42 to 38, and then reached into a bottom drawer. From inside, she pulled out a small brown envelope, slipped something inside, and placed it back in the drawer. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't hurried. It looked more like someone paying a bill than committing a crime. Tracing the envelope. That envelope became the focal point. Over the next 2 weeks, Carol repeated the same action 4 more times. When the store closed one night, Detective Gaines and Richard checked the bottom drawer. The envelope was still there, but empty. They found faint indentations on the paper from where cash had been stacked. This was enough for suspicion, but not enough for a criminal charge. They still needed the bridge proof that the adjusted inventory directly connected to the cash missing from the register. Following the cash, Gaines suggested a controlled internal audit. For 3 days, the assistant managers, all in on the investigation, counted the registers down to the penny after each shift, without telling Carol. They found that on days Carol worked the early shift and processed adjustments, the registers came up short by small, round amounts: $40, $60, $80. On days she wasn't there, the counts balanced. A second name appears. Just when they were ready to move forward, Gaines found something unexpected. Buried in the inventory system's log files was another user account making occasional adjustments, someone named B. Loring. Brian Loring was the store's night stock supervisor. He'd been there for 12 years, worked mostly behind the scenes, and was known for his quiet, no-nonsense demeanor. But here's the catch. The adjustments made under his account always occurred in the same week as Carol, and often targeted similar product categories: bread, dairy, canned goods. It was possible he was just correcting errors. It was also possible he was helping Carol keep her theft pattern hidden by spreading out the changes. The confrontation that was. Richard wanted to pull both into the office and confront them. Gaines shut that idea down immediately. If you confront without a charge, you're giving them a chance to explain it away or destroy evidence. You only get one first strike. Instead, she proposed a coordinated operation. Install a second camera above the night stockroom desk to watch Brian's shift. Stage deliveries with hidden markers on certain items. Track both users' logins in real time. The sting. Over the next week, the footage told a parallel story. Brian's adjustments weren't random. They always came after Carol, as if he were balancing the numbers in a way that made the losses harder to detect in monthly totals. Even more telling, on one night shift, Brian was recorded pulling cash from the register drawer while the till was open for stocking change. sliding it into his pocket without counting. When detectives reviewed the footage of both Carol and Brian, the pattern became undeniable. Carol lowered the recorded inventory, creating extra items in reality. Those items sold normally to customers. Brian skimmed part of the cash at night, ensuring the drawer matched the lower recorded stock count. It was a two-person system, one altering the numbers, the other collecting the profit. Bringing in the warrants. Gaines prepared parallel warrants for both suspects' homes. The timing had to be perfect, neither could be tipped off before the other was served. On the morning of October 15th at 6:00 a.m., two separate teams moved in. At Carol's home, they found a locked filing cabinet containing $8,420 in small bills, along with a folder of handwritten adjustment notes dating back 7 years. At Brian's apartment, they found $3,200 in cash, as well as a spiral-bound ledger with product codes and delivery dates, almost like a shadow inventory log. And yet, as Gaines looked over the evidence, she realized something that made her pause. The totals from both cash finds didn't come close to the estimated $50,000 stolen. If the rest of the money existed, it was still out there. The morning of the dual arrests, Mineral Ridge woke to a low buzz of conversation that traveled faster than the police blotter could print it. It wasn't just that two trusted employees of the Matthews and Sons grocery store had been taken into custody. It was the who. Carol Bentley had been the face of the front counter for over 2 decades. She knew people's children's names, slipped candy canes into kids' bags at Christmas, and remembered if someone preferred paper over plastic. Brian Loring, quiet and dependable, had been the one to help carry heavy bags to customers' cars in the snow. For years, no one had suspected either of them. The interrogations. At the station, Detective Gaines interviewed them separately. Brian cracked first. In a slow, resigned voice, he explained how the scheme began. About 10 years earlier, Carol had approached him with what she framed as a harmless correction trick, a way to fix vendor errors and smooth out the books. It started small, a few dollars here and there, always chalked up to avoiding awkward conversations with suppliers. But soon, Carol began skimming the cash from the sales of unrecorded items, and Brian was given a cut in exchange for running matching adjustments on night shifts. Over time, the cut became routine, an unspoken payday that happened 2 or 3 times a week. When Gaines asked why they hadn't stopped, he just shook his head. After a while, it didn't feel like stealing. It felt like something we'd earned. Carol sighed. Carol, when confronted with Brian's statement, didn't deny the mechanics of the scheme. She denied the intent. She claimed she had started the adjustments to help the store hide small overages or underages so the books balanced perfectly for Richard. The cash she kept, she said, was repayment for years of low wages and unpaid extra hours. When pressed about the amount, nearly $50,000 over the years, she went quiet. Tracing the missing money. The cash found in their homes totaled around $11,600. That left roughly $38,000 unaccounted for. Gaines followed the trail through bank records. Carol had no significant deposits, but she had made several large cash purchases: a new washer and dryer, a set of living room furniture, and multiple high-end handbags. Brian's records showed smaller withdrawals, but his expenses told another story: gambling at a nearby riverboat casino. The rest of the money was gone, absorbed into years of quiet spending. The legal outcome. Both Carol and Brian were charged with felony theft, falsifying business records, and conspiracy. Carol took a plea deal, agreeing to repay $25,000 over a period of 10 years, serve 18 months in county jail, and perform 500 hours of community service. Brian, with a shorter tenure in the scheme but an admission of guilt, received 12 months in jail and probation. Neither was banned from working in retail, a fact that unsettled more than a few people in Mineral Ridge. The store afterward. For Richard Matthews, the impact went beyond the money. The store's atmosphere had changed. Customers were polite but quieter at the register. The friendly small talk felt rehearsed, almost forced, as if everyone was watching for signs of dishonesty in each other. Richard installed a new POS system with restricted access, automatic inventory matching, and daily audits. No single employee could make adjustments without a second login. The invisible trust that had kept the store running for decades had been replaced with visible controls. The quiet lesson. The Matthews and Sons case never made national headlines. It didn't involve masked robbers, dramatic getaways, or a single defining big score. Instead, it was the kind of theft that lives in the margins, in numbers on a page, in quiet shifts before sunrise, in the small changes no one notices until they've accumulated into something much larger. For Detective Gaines, it was a reminder that some of the most costly crimes aren't the loudest. They're the ones where the offenders smile at you in the checkout line, ask about your family, and then, the next morning, adjust the books just enough to make it all disappear. And for the town, the question lingered long after the case was closed. If it took 10 years to catch them, how many other thefts had passed through unnoticed in this town or anywhere else just because no one thought to check the numbers? Story 3. The Key in the River. The Stillwater River runs slow through Dayton, Ohio. Brown-green water, heavy with silt, carrying more tree branches than secrets. On the morning of September 5, 2014, a man named Curtis Leland was fishing along the east bank just north of the Helena Street Bridge. He had no particular plan: catfish if they were biting, smallmouth bass if they weren't. But instead of a fish, his line snagged something solid. At first he thought it was an old can. Then the shape emerged from the murky water, a small, rust-flecked key, its teeth worn smooth, attached to a corroded brass key ring with 3 other keys and a broken grocery store loyalty tag. It didn't look important, but Curtis, being the type who hated litter, slipped the ring into his pocket before packing up his gear. What he didn't know was that those keys had been at the center of a months-long string of burglaries, and that finding them would finally give police their first real lead. The summer burglaries. From May to August 2014, Dayton police had logged 6 residential break-ins with an unusual commonality. No sign of forced entry. Doors had been unlocked from the outside. The burglaries spanned different neighborhoods, but each targeted homes with older-style locks that could be opened with keys. Only small valuables were taken: cash, watches, laptops, and nothing that would slow down a quick exit. There were no witnesses, no security camera hits. The intruder entered and left like a ghost. The working theory was unsettling. The burglar had physical keys to the homes. The problem with the pattern. Detectives noted that all 6 homes had been on the market at some point in the past 3 years. Realtors often used lockboxes for showings, and keys could change hands multiple times before the property sold. But there was no overlap in the real estate agents involved, no single person who had handled all the properties. The case stalled. Curtis's call. 2 days after Curtis found the keys in the river, he mentioned it to his neighbor, who happened to be a retired police officer. The neighbor suggested calling the non-emergency line, just in case. Curtis handed the keys over to a patrol officer, thinking that would be the end of it. The next morning, Detective Corinne Doyle was staring at them on her desk. The test. Doyle had been on the burglary task force for 14 years. She knew that keys, unlike fingerprints, don't tell you much by themselves unless you know where they fit. She had the Property Crimes Unit test them against a small set of seized locks the department kept for training. One of the keys matched a generic brand often used in Dayton rental properties. Another matched a mid-century residential deadbolt. But it was the third key that froze her. It had a distinct triangular bow shaped the kind used for older, custom-cut residential locks. She remembered that same shape from the scene of a June burglary on Ridge Avenue. First connection. With permission from the homeowner, Doyle brought the keys to Ridge Avenue. The triangular key opened the front door on the first try. The homeowner, stunned, confirmed he had never seen the keys before. His own had been recut after moving in, which meant this key had been made before he lived there. If the burglar had been using keys like this, it explained the lack of forced entry. But it also raised an urgent question. How many other doors in Dayton could they still open? Tracing the source. Key blanks aren't unique, but custom cuts are. Doyle visited local locksmiths, bringing photos of the triangular key. At the third shop, she got a reaction. The owner, an older man named Les, said he'd cut that style for a single client over the years, a property maintenance contractor named Roy Kellam. Roy worked for various landlords, fixing plumbing, painting, and importantly, replacing locks. Les remembered one job in particular. About 4 years ago, Roy had ordered multiple duplicates of master keys for a set of rental homes before the locks were repinned. Roy Kellam. Kellam wasn't in the system for burglary, but he had 2 prior arrests for misdemeanor theft in the late 1990s. He'd been working steadily in property maintenance since. But here what stood out. The addresses on his old work orders matched 3 of the 6 burglarized homes. It wasn't proof the jobs had been legitimate, but it was a crack in the wall. The river connection. Why would Roy dump the keys in the Stillwater River? Doyle considered 2 possibilities. He realized police were circling the burglary pattern and got rid of evidence. He had no idea the keys had been lost. Someone else took them from him and disposed of them. Curtis's fishing spot was less than a mile from Roy's house. A quiet approach. Doyle decided not to bring Roy in right away. Instead, she placed his address on a quiet surveillance rotation, 2 unmarked cars driving by at different hours, noting visitors, vehicles, and patterns. For the first week, nothing unusual happened. Roy went to job sites, came home, sat on his porch smoking, and went to bed early. Then, one night just after 11 p.m., a figure left his house carrying a backpack, walking briskly toward the north end of town. The figure was Roy. It was a younger man. When officers tailed him at a distance, he cut through side streets and disappeared into the dark. And that's when Doyle began to wonder. Were the keys ever really Roy's to use, or had someone else been using his past to unlock their present crimes? Detective Corinne Doyle didn't believe in coincidences, not when it came to burglary. A man leaves Roy Kellam's house after dark, carrying a backpack, walks directly toward the neighborhoods where the summer burglaries had occurred, and then disappears. That wasn't a late-night stroll. She also knew that making a move too early could spook whoever was involved. If she wanted to catch them in the act, she needed to know who the younger man was and how he was connected to the keys found in the Stillwater River. Identifying the night walker. Surveillance footage from a gas station 3 blocks from where the man vanished showed a clear side profile. Mid-20s, thin build, baseball cap pulled low. He paid cash for a drink, never looked up at the cameras. The store clerk didn't know him, but remembered seeing him before coming in with the maintenance guy, who bought cigarettes and scratched off lottery tickets. That was Roy Kellam. A quiet background check revealed the man's name, Dylan Shore, 25, with a history of petty theft and 2 years on probation for receiving stolen property. He had listed Roy's address as his residence 6 months earlier. Linking Dylan to the burglaries. Dylan had no car registered in his name, but traffic cameras had twice caught him in the passenger seat of a silver Chevy S10 pickup, Roy's truck, in the early morning hours. One of those times was the night before the June burglary on Ridge Avenue. More telling, Dylan's last known employer was a carpet cleaning company that contracted with realtors and landlords. His job? Moving through vacant homes, often with a key provided by the property manager. It was a perfect position for someone looking to catalog locks that hadn't been changed in years. The bait house. Doyle decided the fastest way to catch Dylan was to give him an opportunity. She worked with a cooperating landlord to stage a vacant rental property in one of the targeted neighborhoods. Inside, they placed visible bait items, a laptop, jewelry box, and small electronics, all tagged with GPS micro-trackers hidden in the cases. The lock on the front door was a match to the triangular key type found in the river. Then they waited. The first attempt. It took 8 days. At 2:17 a.m., a motion sensor inside the bait house triggered. Officers arrived silently, but by the time they entered, the house was empty. The laptop was gone. The tracker showed it moving south, then stopping in a residential neighborhood. The signal ended just outside Roy Kellam's house. The search warrant. This was enough for a judge to sign off on a search warrant for Roy's property. On the morning of October 3rd, officers entered with Doyle leading the team. Roy was cooperative, bewildered, even as they searched. In his garage, they found his old work tools, boxes of spare screws and hinges, and a dusty box of uncut key blanks. But in Dylan's bedroom, they found the bait laptop in plain view on the desk, still powered on. In the closet, a duffel bag with watches, tablets, and small electronics matching descriptions from the summer burglaries. And there was something else, a small tin containing 5 more keys. One of them had the same triangular bow as the key Curtis Leland had pulled from the river. Roy's story. In the interview room, Roy admitted the keys were his, or had been. Years ago, he'd kept duplicates just in case when changing locks, but said he'd never used them illegally. When Dylan moved in, he claimed, the younger man must have taken them without his knowledge. It sounded plausible, but the surveillance of Dylan leaving Roy's house late at night and the shared truck rides made it harder to believe Roy was entirely in the dark. Dylan's first response. Dylan, faced with the laptop and stolen goods in his room, didn't deny the burglaries, but he framed himself as an opportunist, not a planner. I didn't pick the locks, I didn't break anything, I just had the keys. When Doyle asked how he got them, Dylan smirked. They were there. You'd be surprised what people don't notice you taking. The unsettling twist. As the interviews wrapped up, Doyle noticed something strange in the property log from the search. The tin of keys from Dylan's room had 6 spaces, but only 5 keys were inside. One was missing. When she asked Dylan about it, he just shrugged. Guess it's still out there somewhere. It was a simple answer, but it landed like a warning. If one key was gone, there was at least one more door in Dayton that Dylan or someone else could still open without knocking. The missing key was the sort of detail that kept Detective Corinne Doyle awake long after paperwork was done. 5 keys recovered, 1 gone. In burglary cases, every unaccounted for key was a silent invitation, a door that could be opened without force, a crime scene waiting to happen. The charges. Prosecutors moved quickly. Dylan Shore was charged with 6 counts of burglary, 2 counts of receiving stolen property, and 1 count of possessing criminal tools, the keys themselves. The bait house burglary alone was enough for a conviction. The GPS tracker, the surveillance, the stolen laptop on his desk, it was a clean, indisputable link. Roy Kellam was in murkier territory. While Dylan claimed he'd acted alone, prosecutors argued that Roy had created the conditions for the crimes by keeping and failing to secure the keys. They charged him with complicity to commit burglary, though his defense team maintained he had no active role. The trial divide. The courtroom atmosphere was tense. Dylan's trial was short. Faced with clear physical evidence, he took a plea deal, 8 years in prison with parole eligibility after 5. Roy's case was more complex. Without proof that he'd entered any of the homes or directly profited, the jury struggled. In the end, they found him guilty only of misdemeanor negligent entrustment, essentially, failing to secure property that was later used in a crime. He received probation and a $5,000 fine. The recovery of the stolen goods. Over the weeks that followed, police returned dozens of items to burglary victims. Watches engraved with anniversaries, laptops full of family photos, and small electronics. One woman cried when she got back her late husband's wristwatch, a cheap stainless steel piece worth maybe $40, but priceless to her. Not everything was recovered. Many items had already been sold or traded, their trail gone cold. The missing key resurfaces. It was 2 months later when the missing 6th key turned up. A patrol officer in a neighboring suburb responded to a call about an abandoned storage unit. Inside, along with assorted junk, was a ring with a single triangular key. The unit had been rented under a false name. Paperwork led nowhere. When Doyle tested the key, it opened the front door of a house in Dayton that hadn't been burglarized yet. The owners had bought the home 2 years earlier and never changed the locks. They'd been living with a vulnerability they didn't even know existed. The aftermath. The case prompted a wave of lock changes across Dayton. Hardware stores saw a spike in sales of deadbolts, and locksmiths booked weeks in advance. Real estate offices quietly updated policies, mandating immediate rekeying after any property transfer. For Doyle, it was another reminder of a truth she'd learned years ago. Burglary often isn't about force. It's about access, and access can linger long after a door changes hands. Reflection. The story of the key in the river didn't end with a dramatic chase or a safe being cracked open. It ended with a simple, unsettling fact. Someone can walk into your home, not because they broke the lock, but because the lock still trusts them. And for everyone in Dayton, one thought remained. If a single key could sit at the bottom of a river for years before turning up, how many more are still out there, waiting? Story 4. Postcards from a Stranger. The first postcard arrived in May 2012, addressed to Mrs. Linda Parker of Port Gibson, Mississippi. It was handwritten and neat, looping script on the back of a sepia photograph of an old European street scene. The message was short. Dear Linda, thinking of you today. Paris is lovely this time of year. I'll send another when I can. It was signed simply M. Linda didn't know anyone in Paris. She didn't know anyone whose name started with M. She set it aside on the kitchen counter, thinking it was probably a wrong address. But a week later, another card arrived. This time the photograph showed a lighthouse. The message mentioned the weather in Brittany and asked how Linda's garden was doing. Again M. The small-town curiosity. Port Gibson isn't the sort of place where much slips under the radar. The town has a population of just under 1,500, and everyone knows which cars belong in which driveways. So when Linda mentioned the postcards to her neighbor, she learned something odd. She wasn't the only one getting them. 2 other households on her street had received similar cards, different handwriting, different locations mentioned, but always personal in tone, as if from an old friend. The kicker, none of them knew the sender. From curious to unsettling. By July, nearly a dozen residents had received at least one postcard. Some were signed with initials, others with first names. All had foreign postmarks: Lisbon, Madrid, Rome. Some messages contained vague personal references. I hope you've been keeping up with your walking. Or, did you ever repaint that kitchen? Things that could apply to almost anyone. Others were more specific, unsettlingly so. mentioning a pet by name, referencing a child's graduation, or nodding that someone's husband looked tired lately. The postal pattern. Local postmaster Helen Watkins started keeping track. She realized the cards often arrived in clusters 3 or 4 on the same day, to different households, all with similar handwriting styles but from different senders. The postmarks were genuine, they really had been mailed from overseas, but there was no return address on any of them. Enter the police. At first, Port Gibson's police chief, Aaron Poole, thought it was a prank. But when one recipient, an elderly woman named Doris, received a card that referenced the exact make and color of her car and noted it looked nice parked in the driveway again, he decided it was time to investigate. The reference was troubling because Doris's car had been at the mechanic for 3 weeks. It had been back in her driveway for less than 48 hours when the card was postmarked from Spain. The working theory. Poole contacted the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. Their initial thought was that the postcards might be part of a social engineering scheme, a way to gather personal information and establish trust before attempting fraud. If someone could make you believe they knew you, or were connected to you through a friend of a friend, they might later convince you to send money, reveal account information, or grant access to your property. The twist here was the cost and effort involved. Sending real postcards from multiple countries wasn't cheap or quick. Whoever was doing this had money, time, and a reason. A break in the timeline. The investigation got its first real lead in September, when Helen, the postmaster, noticed that several of the postcards, despite different postmarks, had the same U.S. Customs Declaration code printed faintly in the corner. That meant they had all likely been shipped together in bulk to an overseas location, then mailed individually to appear as if they'd been sent at different times. It wasn't someone traveling the world, it was someone making it look like they were. The next step. Chief Poole and the Postal Inspection Service decided to track the next batch. They placed a discreet hold on any incoming postcards matching the pattern and dusted them for prints. When the next 3 arrived in late October, all were addressed to residents who had mentioned travel plans recently in casual conversation at the local grocery store or post office. Whoever was behind it wasn't guessing, they were listening. The question wasn't just why they were doing it, but how close they were standing when they learned the details. When Chief Aaron Poole replayed the last 3 months in his mind, the detail that nagged at him most wasn't the handwriting or the postmarks. It was the timing. How could someone send a card from Spain referencing a car that had only been back in a driveway for 2 days? It wasn't just coincidence. Whoever was behind this was building their postcards from fresh observations, often within 24 to 48 hours of the events they referenced. Mapping the recipients. The Postal Inspection Service's analysts built a map of Port Gibson, with pins marking each household that had received a postcard. At first, the pattern looked random, the pins scattered across town. But when they overlaid the map with public gathering spots, grocery store, post office, gas station, church parking lots, a subtle pattern emerged. Every recipient had been at one of those locations within 2 days before their first card arrived. If you narrowed it further, one location connected them all: the Piggly Wiggly on Main Street. The grocery store connection. Poole paid a visit to the store's manager, a man named Ray Sloan, who'd been running the place for 20 years. Ray was skeptical. "We've got half the town coming through here every week. You think someone's writing postcards about them?" But when Poole asked about the store's employees, Ray hesitated. One name stood out: Deborah Lance. She worked part-time at the store, stocking shelves and chatting with customers. But she was also known for traveling frequently. Twice in the past year she'd been gone for weeks at a time, claiming to visit a friend overseas. Watching Deborah. Deborah was in her late 50s, friendly, with the kind of conversational style that made people want to tell her things. She remembered kids' names, noticed new haircuts, and asked follow-up questions about people's pets. Poole asked the Postal Inspection Service to run her name through their database. They found a customs declaration linked to a package she'd mailed from Port Gibson to Lisbon 6 months earlier containing personal correspondence. The mail drop theory. Investigators began to suspect that Deborah wasn't mailing the postcards from each country at all. Instead, she was shipping batches of pre-written cards to contacts overseas, who would then send them individually from different post offices. This explained the foreign postmarks and the identical customs code found on earlier cards. But the bigger question was why? Intercepted mail. In late November, postal inspectors got the break they needed. They intercepted a padded envelope Deborah mailed to an address in Spain. Inside were 22 handwritten postcards, each addressed to a different Port Gibson resident. The messages referenced recent events: a yard sale, a new fence, a hospital stay that had happened within the last 2 weeks. All of the information was public or casually overheard. There was no direct threat in any of the cards, but each one contained enough personal detail to make the recipient think the sender knew them. The possible endgame. The Postal Inspection Service had seen similar methods used in long-game scams. By sending benign, friendly correspondence over time, a scammer could create a false relationship, then, months later, request money for an emergency or offer an investment opportunity. In smaller communities, the impact could be worse, planting doubt, suspicion, and discomfort between neighbors. If Deborah had been doing this for months, she was laying groundwork for something much bigger. The confrontation. Poole decided to speak to Deborah in person before moving forward. He found her on the grocery store floor, lining up cans of soup. She smiled and asked how his mother was doing, a detail he hadn't mentioned to her in months. When he asked about the postcards, she didn't deny sending them. She laughed lightly and said, "Oh, I just like keeping in touch with people, even if they don't remember me." She claimed she'd met most of the recipients at some point in her life, and that the overseas mailing was a fun little project with friends. But when Poole asked what the project was for, she just shrugged. And that was the problem: either she was telling the truth, or she was lying in the calmest, most casual way possible. Chief Aaron Poole had been in law enforcement long enough to know when someone was being evasive. Deborah Lance's shrug wasn't the kind of nervous gesture you see from someone who's afraid of getting caught. It was the shrug of someone who didn't think what they'd done was wrong. Building the case. The U.S. Postal Inspection Service moved cautiously. While the intercepted envelope of 22 postcards proved Deborah was behind the mailings, none of the messages contained explicit threats, solicitations for money, or direct harassment. Technically, sending unsolicited mail isn't a crime unless it crosses into fraud, stalking, or other prohibited uses. But the inspectors noted something subtle. Many of Deborah's messages referenced recent purchases, travel, or repairs at the recipients' homes. If someone were inclined to commit burglary, that kind of information could be invaluable. Interviewing the recipients. When inspectors interviewed the postcard recipients, reactions varied. Some laughed it off, "She's just eccentric." Others admitted they'd felt uneasy, even violated, by the personal references. One elderly man said he'd stopped answering his phone because he thought the person from the cards might call next. One woman whose husband worked nights said she'd begun sleeping with a light on in the living room after receiving a postcard that read, "The house looks nice in the evenings, so quiet now." The overseas connection. The friends Deborah claimed to have overseas turned out to be pen pal contacts she'd met on travel forums. Most lived in Europe, and were paid small amounts via online transfers to drop her postcards into local mailboxes. When asked why she went to that trouble, Deborah simply said, "It makes people feel special to get something from far away." The legal resolution. In the end, prosecutors determined they didn't have enough to charge Deborah with fraud or harassment, but they did issue a cease and desist order under postal regulations, barring her from sending mail to anyone who hadn't explicitly consented. Her employer quietly removed her from the grocery store schedule, citing public discomfort. The quiet fallout. Deborah moved out of Port Gibson within 6 months. She didn't tell anyone where she was going, but a year later, the Postal Inspection Service received a tip from another small town in Louisiana. Residents were receiving handwritten postcards from overseas, signed with a single initial. Reflection. Cases like this rarely end with a courtroom drama or a neatly tied bow. The postcards from a stranger never became an outright scam, never asked for money, never made a direct threat. But for the people in Port Gibson, the effect was lasting. The cards turned everyday moments into something slightly sinister, proof that even the smallest scraps of information, a casual conversation in the checkout line, a mention of a pet's name, can be gathered, cataloged, and sent back to you from thousands of miles away. In the end, the most unsettling thing was what Deborah wrote. It was realizing that someone had been listening all along. Story 5. The Vanishing Janitor. On January 18, 2007, the last person to see Charles "Chuck" Milford was a security guard doing his rounds at the Bremer office complex in Omaha, Nebraska. It was just after midnight. Chuck was mopping the tiled floor of the lobby, earbuds in, a styrofoam cup of coffee balanced on a supply cart. He waved to the guard without looking up. The guard kept walking. By 6:00 a.m., when the first employees arrived, Chuck and his cart were gone. The overnight routine. Chuck had worked as a night janitor in the Bremer complex for nearly 14 years. His shift started at 10:00 p.m. and ended at 6:00 a.m., 5 nights a week. He was meticulous. Floors buffed to a shine, trash cans emptied, blinds adjusted so no sunlight glared on computer screens in the morning. The building was secured by a badge access system. Every time an employee swiped in or out, it logged their card number, location, and timestamp. Chuck's badge recorded his entry at 9:57 p.m. on January 17th. It never recorded an exit. The building layout. The Bremer complex wasn't a skyscraper, just 4 floors of office space and a small basement storage area. There were no open windows or loading docks that could be used to leave without triggering a security camera. Every external door was alarmed. None had gone off during Chuck's shift. The security guard's sweep logs placed him on every floor that night, including the lobby where he saw Chuck. After that, nothing. The initial search. When Chuck didn't clock out or return home, his supervisor called police. The Omaha PD searched the entire building, bathrooms, storage closets, even ceiling crawl spaces. They found his mop leaning against the wall in the lobby, bucket full of soapy water. His jacket hung on a hook in the janitor's closet. His wallet, keys, and phone sat on a shelf above it. There was no sign of a struggle. The first theory. Police initially considered a medical emergency. Maybe Chuck collapsed in an unused office and hadn't been found. But the thorough search ruled that out. Then came the second theory. Chuck had voluntarily left the building using an unmonitored route. But security footage showed no sign of him in the stairwells, elevators, or near any door after midnight. It was as if he'd stepped out of view and never stepped back in. An odd discovery. 3 days into the investigation, a maintenance worker checking the basement storage room noticed something strange. A door in the far corner, normally locked and rarely used, was ajar. It opened into a narrow utility tunnel that ran beneath the street to a separate building across the block, a former warehouse now converted into storage units. The tunnel had been installed decades earlier and was no longer part of the building's official schematics. No security cameras covered it. Following the tunnel, detectives traced the tunnel to the storage building. Inside, they found a service door propped open with a folded piece of cardboard. But here's the thing: the storage building's own security system hadn't logged an entry that night. Whoever came through the tunnel never swiped in. A name in the storage records. The storage company's rental logs showed that one of the units had been rented, cash only, for nearly 2 years by a John Milner. An alias police quickly learned was connected to stolen identity cases in Iowa. The unit was emptied 2 days before Chuck's disappearance. The question wasn't just what had been stored there, but whether Chuck had known about it. Detectives from Omaha PD obtained a warrant for the now empty unit rented under the name John Milner. At first glance, it looked exactly like you'd expect. Bare concrete floor, corrugated metal walls, no furniture or boxes. But the forensics team noticed faint dust outlines along the floor and walls, rectangular shapes that suggested there had been containers, maybe crates, stacked neatly against the sides. On the floor near the back wall, they found a small brass button. It wasn't from a janitor's uniform. Tracing the alias, John Milner had been used in several transactions over the past decade: a used car purchase in Council Bluffs, a post office box in Des Moines, and the lease on this storage unit. The trail was thin: all cash payments, minimal paperwork, and when IDs were required, they were counterfeit. But 2 months before Chuck disappeared, the storage unit account was paid for a full year in advance. Whoever rented it had expected to keep it. The early termination 2 days before Chuck went missing was sudden and deliberate. Revisiting the tunnel. The utility tunnel between the Bremer complex and the storage building had no motion sensors, no cameras, and no alarms. According to the building's oldest maintenance blueprints, there was also a narrow service hatch halfway along its length that opened to a storm drain running under the street. When detectives opened the hatch, they found scuff marks along the edges, recent, like someone had squeezed through while carrying something heavy. The storm drain eventually led to a maintenance ladder that surfaced behind a row of dumpsters in an alley 2 blocks away. That alley's cameras had been out for months. The witness. It wasn't until a week later that a witness came forward. A man named Phil Carden, who worked nights delivering bread to nearby restaurants, remembered seeing a short guy in coveralls in that alley around 12:30 a.m. the night Chuck disappeared. The man wasn't carrying anything, but he was followed by 2 others taller, both in dark jackets. Phil didn't think much of it until he saw Chuck's face on the news. He was pretty sure the first man was him. Chuck's background. The deeper detectives dug into Chuck's life, the more they found a picture of a man who kept to himself. He had no immediate family in Nebraska, no significant debt, and no known enemies. But one detail stood out. Back in the late 1980s, Chuck had briefly worked for a cleaning contractor in Des Moines, the same city, where the John Milner identity had been linked to a post office box. It was a thin thread, but it connected Chuck's past to the alias at the center of this mystery. The possible scenario. Detectives began to consider a theory. Chuck may have discovered the tunnel access to the storage building. He may have stumbled on or been involved in whatever John Milner was storing. When the unit was abruptly emptied, he might have been taken to ensure his silence. But they still lacked one thing: proof he ever went through that tunnel. The first breakthrough. That proof came from an unexpected place: a janitor's key, ring found wedged in the tunnel's floor grate near the service hatch. It was Chuck. His initials were etched into the back of the master key for the Bremer complex. The fact that the keys were left behind suggested one of two things. He dropped them during a struggle, or he left them intentionally as a clue. The problem was, if it was a clue, no one knew what it was pointing toward or if it was already too late to follow it. The master keys lying in the tunnel grate were the first concrete link between Charles Chuck, Milford, and the unlisted utility passage. But for detectives, they also posed a troubling question. Why would someone in Chuck's position drop his only way back into the Bremer complex before leaving the building? Following the storm drain, detectives decided to trace the tunnel route the night Chuck disappeared. Starting in the basement of the Bremer complex, they walked the narrow concrete corridor, counting the steps to the small service hatch. The hatch opened into the storm-drained shoulder width, smelling of rust and wet leaves, and after 30 feet, the drain emerged behind the dumpster-lined alley. This was the same alley where the bread delivery driver claimed to have seen Chuck and the two men in dark jackets. A forgotten camera. Most cameras in the alley had been out of order for months, but a nearby pawn shop had recently installed a new system. The camera didn't point into the alley, but it caught a corner view of the street. The night Chuck vanished, at 12:37 a.m., the footage showed a white panel van pulling away from the alley and heading east. No license plate was visible, but the side panel bore a faded logo, a blue triangle with letters mostly worn away. That triangle matched the branding of a now-defunct moving company, TriStar Relocation, dissolved in 2004, but known in its later years for paying cash for unofficial jobs. The warehouse lead. When detectives tracked down former TriStar drivers, one name came up: Glenn Riker, a man who'd been involved in off-the-books storage moves for private clients. Riker's last known address was across the river in Council Bluffs. When Omaha PD visited, the house was empty, the lease terminated a week earlier. In the garage, they found an old TriStar logo stencil, spray paint cans, and several lengths of nylon strapped, the kind used to secure cargo inside moving vans. Linking back to John Milner. A handwriting analysis of the John Milner storage rental forms showed similarities to Riker's signature on older employment records. It became increasingly likely that Riker was Milner, and that Chuck either stumbled upon his operation or was coerced into helping move the final contents of the storage unit. Where the trail went cold. Despite multiple warrants, no trace of Chuck was found in Riker's abandoned house, vehicles, or known associates' properties. No body, no definitive evidence of foul play beyond the disappearance itself. By late spring, the case entered the frustrating phase detectives dread, where everything points in one direction, but nothing can be proven beyond speculation. The call. 9 months after Chuck vanished, Chief Aaron Poole's desk phone rang. It was an anonymous male voice. "Tell the janitor's people not to look. He's somewhere they can't find, and he's fine with that." The call was traced to a payphone 2 states away. The voice was never identified. Reflection. The Bremer complex replaced all locks and sealed the utility tunnel permanently. The John Milner alias never surfaced again. Glenn Riker was never arrested. Some detectives believe Chuck was forced into silence, either paid off or threatened into disappearing. Others think he might have chosen to vanish, seeing something in that storage unit that convinced him life in Omaha was no longer safe. For the employees who still pass the janitor's closet each night, the mop and bucket have long been replaced. But the space still smells faintly of the industrial soap Chuck used, a quiet, persistent reminder that you can lock every door in a building and still lose someone without a sound. Story 6. The quietest hostage situation. On the morning of October 11, 1999, the Sunville Community Bank opened its doors in rural western Kansas like it always did. Coffee brewing in the break room, a local radio station playing softly at the teller counter, and the smell of copier toner lingering in the manager's office. By 9:10 a.m., there were 6 employees inside and 3 customers scattered between the lobby chairs and the teller line. No alarms, no panic, no one yelling. And yet from 9:05 a.m. to nearly 11:30 a.m., every single person in that building was technically a hostage. The man in the jacket. He came in wearing a navy windbreaker, khaki pants, and a baseball cap pulled low. Mid-40s, average height, unremarkable. No mask, no gloves. He waited patiently in the short teller line, holding a small messenger bag. When it was his turn, he placed the bag on the counter, leaned in slightly, and spoke in a conversational tone. The teller, 23-year-old Stephanie Harper, would later recall his exact words. "I want you to know there's a device in here. I have the control in my hand. We're going to move slowly and quietly. No alarms, no phones. Everyone will go home today if you listen." The device. The device was never shown. The man rested his hand inside the bag, occasionally adjusting it. He instructed Stephanie to ask for the branch manager, but not in a way that would alarm anyone else. When manager Tom Reddick approached, the man calmly asked for access to the conference room. He gestured for the other tellers to join them, along with the 2 customers closest to the counter. No one screamed. No one ran. He kept his voice low, steady, the kind you might use when explaining directions. Closing the net. Once inside the conference room, the man had everyone sit at the long table. He pulled a stack of plastic zip ties from his jacket pocket and asked Stephanie to help him by securing everyone's wrists. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply said, "We're going to take our time. The quieter this is, the better for all of us." Over the next 10 minutes, he brought in the remaining employees and customers one by one, until the entire bank, 9 people were seated in the room. The unusual demands. Unlike most bank robberies, he didn't order anyone to empty the teller drawers immediately. Instead, he handed Tom Reddick a folded piece of paper. On it was a list, specific cash amounts from the vault, certain bundles of $50 and $100 bills, and a note instructing that each stack be wrapped in plain paper before being placed into his messenger bag. He told Tom exactly how to disable the security die packs and GPS trackers hidden in the bundles. Time passing. For nearly 2 hours, the process unfolded with an eerie calm. Tom retrieved the money while Stephanie kept track of who had been tied and where they were seated. The man occasionally paced the room but never raised his voice. He refused offers of water or food. His only repeated instruction was, "No one outside this room needs to know anything until I'm gone." The departure. At 11:27 a.m., he collected the bag, thanked everyone for their cooperation, and instructed them to remain seated for 10 minutes. He walked out the front door, got into a faded green sedan, and drove away at normal speed. When police arrived, they found no explosive device, just a plastic casing with wires, weighted to feel substantial. The total loss, $142,000 in unmarked bills. At first glance, it looked like a meticulously planned, one-man job. But in the days that followed, detectives found one detail that didn't fit. The robber seemed to know exactly which cash bundles had working die packs, something only an insider could have told him. Detectives from the Kansas Bureau of Investigation, KBI, began their review the same way they approached any bank robbery. Gather witness statements. Check camera footage. Identify the escape route. But the Sunville case was unusual from the start. The cameras that missed. Sunville Community Bank had 6 internal security cameras. 4 of them were positioned in the lobby and teller areas, all pointing toward the front entrance. The robber never looked directly at them. His baseball cap kept his face in shadow, and his posture was careful. Two cameras inside the conference room should have captured most of the event, but they had been disabled, their power cords unplugged and tucked neatly behind the credenza. The only person who could have accessed that conference room without raising suspicion before the robbery, a bank employee. Knowledge of the die packs. Standard operating procedure at the bank meant that die packs were placed randomly within cash bundles each morning. Only senior tellers and the branch manager knew which stacks had them on any given day. The robber's written list specifying which bundles to take was too accurate to be guessed. He hadn't just known where the die packs were that day. He'd known which specific bills had them. Narrowing the pool. KBI agents quietly reviewed employee histories. Of the 9 people in the building that morning, 3 had the necessary knowledge of die pack placement. Tom Reddick, branch manager, 12 years in the position. Stephanie Harper, head teller, employed for 5 years. Gina Walsh, assistant manager, 2 years on staff after transferring from a Wichita branch. None had obvious financial trouble or criminal history, but Gina's personnel file contained a note from her previous branch. Termination recommended if performance doesn't improve, high error rate in cash handling. She had left before that recommendation could be acted on. An overheard conversation. A week into the investigation, a Sunville Bank employee, not one of the hostages, mentioned something odd to detectives. 2 weeks before the robbery, he'd overheard Gina on the phone in the break room, saying, "If we ever needed to, I know how to get around those." When he'd stepped into the room, she'd ended the call abruptly. The green sedan. The faded green sedan seen leaving the bank was traced to a rental company in Topeka. The paperwork showed it had been rented under a false name, but the security footage from the rental lot caught a glimpse of the renter, a man in his 40s, average height, wearing a windbreaker. Next to him in the footage, leaning on the counter as he signed the form, was Gina Walsh. The quiet interview. When agents brought Gina in, she was polite, even chatty. She claimed the man was a cousin from out of state who needed a ride. She denied knowing anything about the robbery. But when shown stills from the bank's lobby camera, she froze. The robber's build, she admitted, looked like her cousin, a man named Alan Carr, who lived in Arizona. Carr, as it turned out, had served 7 years for armed robbery in the late 80s. The 2-person job. It was now clear. Gina had fed Carr inside information, die pack placement, conference room layout, employee schedules, and likely arranged for the cameras to be disabled before the robbery began. Carr's calm demeanor during the heist made sense. He knew no one would resist if he kept it quiet, and no alarms would trip as long as Gina's instructions were followed. The only problem, Carr was already gone and Gina wasn't talking about where. The moment Gina Walsh's connection to Alan Carr was established, the KBI issued a warrant for her arrest on charges of aiding and abetting a bank robbery, conspiracy to commit bank robbery, and obstruction of justice. But the arrest didn't happen at her home or at the bank. It happened in the parking lot of a highway diner, just outside Salina, a full 2 hours from Sunville. She was in the driver's seat of her silver Ford, engine running, with a single duffel bag in the passenger seat. Inside, $12,000 in cash. Gina talks, but only so much. At first, Gina denied everything, but after hours of questioning, she admitted to helping Alan plan it, although she insisted she thought it would be a small, quiet grab and not an hours-long hostage situation. She claimed Alan had promised her $50,000 for her part, to be paid in installments after he got clear. When asked where Alan had gone, she gave a vague answer. He said something about heading west, maybe California. He's got people there. Tracking Alan. KBI worked with the FBI to trace Alan's movements. Surveillance footage placed him in Albuquerque 3 days after the robbery, purchasing a used motorcycle with cash. After that, the trail went cold. The working theory was that he'd crossed into Mexico within a week, using secondary roads to avoid border checkpoints. The money trail. The bank had lost $142,000 that morning. Between the cash in Gina's duffel bag and what was likely spent on travel and vehicles, over $120,000 remained unaccounted for. Some suspected Gina knew where it was. Others believed Alan had no intention of sharing. The trial. Gina's trial was short. Prosecutors presented the rental car footage, her phone records with Alan in the weeks before the robbery, and her unexplained possession of stolen cash. She was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. She never testified against Alan. Sunville afterward. Sunville Community Bank changed its entire security protocol. Conference room access was restricted during business hours. Multiple employees now handled die pack placement, with daily changes to procedure. All security camera feeds were monitored remotely to prevent unplugging from going unnoticed. Yet for the people who were in that conference room, the physical changes weren't the thing that lingered. It was the memory of how calm it all was. No shouting, no chaos, just the sound of chairs sliding on carpet, paper wrapping around cash, and a voice saying, "Everyone will go home today if you listen." Reflection. In the end, the quietest hostage situation became a case study in control not through force, but through calculated calm and inside knowledge. Alan Carr has never been found. No one knows if he's living quietly somewhere under a new name, or if the desert swallowed him long ago. What the hostages remember most isn't his face, it's his voice, and the way it made them believe, if only for a few hours, that being held hostage could feel almost ordinary. Story 7. Numbers in the Wallpaper. In March 2015, when Samantha Lee moved into apartment 3B of the old Grant building in Rochester, New York, she thought she'd found a bargain. The building was dated but sturdy, the rent was below market, and the landlord was eager to hand over the keys. The only thing she didn't love was the wallpaper in the bedroom, a faded floral pattern that looked like it had been hung decades earlier. But 2 weeks after moving in, she noticed something odd. On one wall, near the corner by the window, there was a tiny series of numbers printed faintly in the beige space between the flowers. 734-1922. More than decoration. At first, she thought it was a manufacturing mark from the wallpaper company, but once she started looking, she saw other numbers. 411-0533 above the closet door. 820-217-09 near the baseboard by the radiator. Some were upright, others sideways, as if added by hand after the wallpaper was hung. When she mentioned it to a friend, he joked it was like the apartments got cheat codes. The landlord's reaction. Curious, Samantha asked the landlord, Howard Bennett, about the numbers. He frowned and said, "Probably old inventory marks. Don't worry about it." But the way he avoided eye contact made her uneasy. Later, when she searched online for the apartment's address, she found a short article from 2003. Local man found dead in Grant building apartment, possible overdose. The apartment number, 3B. The first match. One rainy Saturday, Samantha decided to write down all the numbers she could find. There were 17 sets in total, scattered across all 4 walls. On a whim, she typed one into Google exactly as it appeared. 734-1922. The first result was a link to a New York State court record, a criminal case from 1998 involving narcotics distribution. She tried another, 411-0533. This one pulled up a property tax lien filed against an address, in a different part of the city. They weren't random numbers. The break-in. A week later, Samantha came home to find the apartment door ajar. Nothing was missing, but the papers where she'd written down the number list were gone from her desk. There was no sign of forced entry. The landlord claimed he hadn't been inside. That night, she found a new number scratched faintly into the wallpaper above her bed, 926-0411. When she searched it online, she froze. It was a closed case file for an unsolved robbery in Rochester from 2011. Police interest. Samantha reported the break-in and mentioned the numbers to the responding officer. At first, he seemed skeptical until she showed him her search results. 2 days later, a detective from the Rochester PD's cold case unit contacted her. He wanted to see the apartment in person. As he examined the walls, he told her something she didn't expect. These aren't case numbers. They're index codes for our evidence storage system. Every number she'd found corresponded to an item in police evidence: seized drugs, stolen goods, unclaimed property. That meant whoever put them there knew exactly what was in those files and had access to the storage system at some point. Detective Mark Rivas from the Rochester PD Cold Case Unit didn't waste time. After matching the first 10 wallpaper numbers to specific entries in the department's evidence database, his mood shifted from curiosity to concern. "These aren't just random pieces of evidence," he told Samantha. "They're all high-value cash, gold, unclaimed jewelry, and some of these cases are so old the statute of limitations has already run out." That meant if someone could locate those items outside the evidence room, they could sell them without much legal risk. The apartment's past tenants. Rivas requested the tenant history for apartment 3B from the building's management company. The names went back 20 years, but one stood out: Leonard "Lenny" Groves, a former Rochester PD property clerk who had been fired in 2004 for policy violations after discrepancies were found in the evidence inventory. Groves had lived in 3B from 2000 to 2003, the same years most of the evidence codes on Samantha's wall were originally entered into the database. How the codes got there. According to a retired detective Rivas interviewed, Groves had been known for his system, a way of remembering where certain pieces of evidence were stored without having to pull the official logs. The codes on Samantha's wall matched the shorthand he used in his personal notebooks. The theory was that Groves had written them directly on the wallpaper for easy reference, assuming no one would ever think to look there. The break-in connection. The timing of Samantha's break-in now looked different. If someone had recently learned about the wallpaper codes, maybe a friend or associate of Groves, they could have entered the apartment to retrieve them. The missing paper list Samantha had compiled might have been their main goal. That also meant the fresh number she'd found, 926-0411, could be a warning or bait. Evidence room audit. Rivas ordered a quiet audit of the current evidence room holdings. It didn't take long to find irregularities. 3 items connected to the codes on Samantha's wall were missing entirely from the shelves. The sign-out logs had no record of removal. 2 other items had been replaced with worthless substitutes: a fake gold necklace in place of a real one, and a stack of photocopied bills instead of cash. Whoever had taken them knew both the layout of the evidence room and how to bypass the logging system. Watching the apartment. For the next week, Rivas set up an unmarked surveillance van across from the Grant building. On the 4th night, just after 2 a.m., a man in a dark hoodie approached Samantha's door with a set of keys. He entered without knocking. The confrontation. Rivas and his team moved in fast. The man was caught in the act of peeling back a section of wallpaper near the closet. When they removed his hood, Samantha didn't recognize him, but Rivas did. It was Paul Harkness, a current property clerk in the evidence room. Harkness claimed he'd come to inspect something for the landlord, but the key in his pocket matched the lock to Samantha's door. In his backpack were photos of the wallpaper numbers, a portable scanner, and a small crowbar. Now the focus shifted from an old fired clerk to someone still inside the police system. And if Harkness knew about the codes, who else did? Paul Harkness's arrest turned the case from an odd curiosity into an active corruption probe inside the Rochester Police Department. Detective Mark Rivas knew the public fallout could be ugly. A property clerk caught breaking into a civilian's apartment to harvest hidden codes tied to missing evidence. But he also knew this was likely just the surface. Harkness talks. Under questioning, Harkness admitted he'd known about the codes for nearly a year. He claimed he'd learned about them from a retired officer who used to work with Leonard "Lenny" Groves, the disgraced property clerk who had once lived in apartment 3B. According to Harkness, Groves had kept an off-site ledger of valuable evidence items he planned to reclaim once they were forgotten in storage. After Groves' death in 2014, word about the ledger and the wallpaper trickled through old contacts. Harkness said he thought the codes in the apartment were all that remained, but when Samantha moved in, he panicked that she might figure them out before he could get to them. The wider net. Rivas and Internal Affairs used Harkness's cooperation to dig further. They uncovered a small ring of current and former police employees who had been quietly siphoning valuables from the evidence room for years. The scheme was simple. Use old codes or inside knowledge to identify high-value, low-priority items. Replace them with worthless substitutes. Remove them without logging, betting that no one would notice in cold cases or forfeiture property. The wallpaper in 3B had been an early version of this system, Groves's personal reference sheet, hiding in plain sight. The evidence audit. The full audit took months. By the end, the department had to acknowledge that more than $400,000 worth of seized assets had been lost, stolen, or replaced over a span of nearly 2 decades. Some of it was recovered jewelry found in pawn shops, electronics sold online, but much of it was gone forever. Samantha moves out. Samantha didn't wait for the investigation to finish. She broke her lease and left the Grant building within a month of Harkness's arrest. Before she turned in her keys, she stripped the bedroom walls bare. Underneath the floral paper, more codes were hidden, written directly on the plaster in black marker, some faded, some fresh. She photographed them for Rivas before the landlord painted over the walls. Reflection. In the official report, Operation Wallpaper was credited with dismantling a long-running theft ring inside the Rochester PD. The press focused on the numbers hidden in plain sight, the oddity of a wall doubling as a criminal ledger. But Samantha would tell you something different. The most unsettling part was that her apartment's walls had been covered with stolen evidence codes. It was that someone, years later, was still adding new ones, and no one could say exactly when. Story 8. The Park Bench Conspiracy. In May 2010, a city parks maintenance worker in Grand Rapids, Michigan, noticed something strange about one of the benches in Calder Park. Every Tuesday morning, a man in his late 60s would sit on the same bench near the fountain, always holding a folded newspaper. He never stayed long, maybe 10 minutes. He didn't feed the birds, talk to anyone, or read the paper. He'd set it down beside him on the bench, get up, and walk away. Within minutes, someone else, sometimes a jogger, sometimes a woman pushing a stroller, would sit in the exact same spot, pick up the paper, and leave with it tucked under their arm. It was odd enough that the maintenance worker mentioned it to a park security guard. The guard, curious, started watching. The pattern repeated every Tuesday. A quiet exchange. By the third week, The guard decided to take the newspaper after the first man left, before the second arrived. Inside, folded between the pages, was an envelope containing $3,000 in cash. The guard turned it over to the police. The investigation begins. Detectives set up surveillance on the bench. What they saw was surprisingly consistent. Man with newspaper arrives between 9:05 and 9:10 a.m., sits for about 10 minutes. Leaves newspaper on bench. Second person arrives within 5 minutes, collects the paper, leaves quickly. The drop-offs and pickups were smooth, no direct handoffs, no lingering conversation. Following the money. When the second person left the park, plainclothes officers followed. The first pickup led them to a nearby coffee shop, where the woman handed the envelope to a man sitting at the counter. The second week, the pickup was a man in a business suit who walked 3 blocks to a downtown apartment building before passing the envelope to a resident in the lobby. Each week, the courier was different. The pension angle. The cash in the first envelope matched an unusual withdrawal from a local credit union. When detectives subpoenaed the account records, they found it belonged to a man named Walter Dunn, who had died in 2003. And yet the account had been receiving monthly pension deposits from the state for the past 7 years. How the bench fit in. Detectives suspected the bench was part of a larger system for moving stolen pension money without drawing attention. Instead of direct bank transfers or checks, the conspirators withdrew the money in cash, left it in an agreed-upon location, and used different people to pick it up and pass it along. The park bench was just one of the drop points. Expanding the search. When investigators widened surveillance to other parks, they found similar patterns, different benches, same method. The man with the newspaper wasn't the only dropper. There were 3 others, each using a specific bench on a specific day. And behind all of them was one name that kept appearing on the withdrawal slips: Eleanor Brandt, 72, retired city employee. The odd part, Eleanor was still alive, living quietly in a suburban ranch house, and when detectives visited her, she swore she had never set foot in Calder Park in her life. Detectives from Grand Rapids PD's Financial Crimes Unit didn't expect Eleanor Brandt to be the keystone in the bench operation, but her name was on too many withdrawal slips to ignore. When they sat in her modest living room, she seemed genuinely bewildered. She produced her own pension statements, modest amounts deposited into her personal checking account every month, and insisted she'd never used the credit union account the police showed her. The records told a different story. The Eleanor Brandt linked to the Calder Park account had a different middle name, a different social security number by 1 digit, and a date of birth off by 2 years. It was a synthetic identity, part real, part fabricated. Someone had built a second Eleanor on paper, using enough of the real woman's details to make it look legitimate to the pension office. The bigger picture. If the conspirators had done this once, they could have done it dozens of times. Detectives pulled pension deposit records from the state's retirement system for the past decade, looking for anomalies, accounts that had no corresponding tax filings, were accessed only in cash withdrawals, had no spending patterns other than immediate cash removal. The search returned 32 such accounts. Following the benches, undercover officers expanded surveillance to 5 parks over the next month. Each bench had a fixed drop day. Calder Park, Tuesdays at 9:10 a.m. Fairview Green, Wednesdays at 3:45 p.m. Roosevelt Commons, Fridays at noon. The droppers were mostly older individuals, each using a different style of concealment: newspapers, tote bags, coffee cups with false bottoms. The pickups were varied: young, old, men, women. Some lingered in the park for a few minutes before collecting the item, others walked straight up, grabbed it, and left without sitting down. The first mistake. On a rainy Thursday in June, a dropper at Roosevelt Commons arrived earlier than usual. The pickup didn't happen within the usual 5-minute window. Instead, the envelope sat under the bench for nearly 40 minutes before a man in his 30s arrived and collected it. Officers followed him to a strip mall 2 miles away, where he entered a back office in a small tax preparation business. That business, Grayson and Ward Financial Services, had already appeared once in the investigation as the listed employer on one of the synthetic pension accounts. Cracking the middle layer, detectives learned that Grayson and Ward was a shell. It filed minimal tax documents, rented a small office with no real clientele, and was managed by a woman named Paula Risto. Paula had a clean criminal record but an interesting work history. She'd spent 14 years as an administrative assistant at the state pension office before retiring in 2005. In other words, she'd had insider access to pension records, personal data, and beneficiary files. Linking Paula to the benches. Bank records showed that cash withdrawals from several synthetic pension accounts matched dates and times of known bench drops. Paula's name never appeared on the accounts, but she had signed rental agreements for 2 safety deposit boxes in a downtown bank, both paid for in cash. Detectives suspected those boxes held the collected funds before they were laundered or distributed. The question now wasn't just how Paula's network worked, it was how far it reached, and how many pensioners walking past those benches didn't actually exist. Detectives had enough on Paula Risto to move. Surveillance footage, rental records for safety deposit boxes, and the pension account anomalies created a tight circle around her. But they wanted the arrests to hit the entire network at once: the droppers, the couriers, and the people cashing out the stolen pensions. The takedown. In late August 2010, the Grand Rapids PD coordinated with the state attorney general's office for a multi-location raid. On a Tuesday morning, officers moved in. Calder Park, the man with the Tuesday newspaper, was arrested as he placed an envelope under the bench. Roosevelt Commons, a courier was intercepted walking toward the tax preparation business. Fairview Green, 2 droppers were picked up within minutes of each other. At the same time, detectives served a warrant at Paula's suburban home. Inside her office they found ledger books with dates, amounts, and initials all matching the weekly bench drops. 30 laminated ID cards bearing names of synthetic pension beneficiaries. $84,000 in cash inside a bedroom dresser. The safety deposit boxes held another $220,000, mostly in small bills, along with a list of bench schedules for 8 different parks. The scope. Investigators confirmed the conspiracy had been running for at least 9 years. Paula's role was simple but devastating. She identified dormant or vulnerable pension accounts, created duplicate beneficiaries, and arranged for her version to receive the monthly deposits. The bench system was the low-tech solution for moving the cash without electronic transfers that might flag an audit. Over that period, they estimated $3.1 million had been siphoned away. The sentences. Paula Risto pleaded guilty to fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy, receiving a 14-year sentence. The droppers and couriers faced lesser charges. Most claimed they believed they were helping deliver money for legitimate clients who wanted privacy. Some avoided prison by cooperating. Others received 1-3 years. Aftermath in the parks. The city removed or relocated benches in several parks, hoping to break the association in people's minds. But the truth was, the benches had only been one part of the system. In the final ledger seized from Paula's home, there were handwritten notes beside certain entries: Alt Lock, Switch 1114, and CP Backup. Detectives suspected Alt Lock meant alternative drop spots, ones they hadn't found before the takedown. Reflection: the park bench conspiracy was a reminder that complex crimes don't always need complex tools. A public park, a folded newspaper, and a willing network were all it took to siphon millions from a government system, without anyone noticing for nearly a decade. Even after the arrests, some officers in the Financial Crimes Unit still visited those parks on the old drop days, not because they expected Paula's people to return, but because they weren't convinced every bench had been found. And in a quiet corner of Calder Park, the Tuesday morning slot remained open. Story 9: The Library Lockbox. In January 2018, the downtown branch of the Albany Public Library was in the middle of a routine renovation. The plan was simple: upgrade the circulation desk, repaint the reading rooms, and install a new book drop system. On the third morning of work, a carpenter removing the old metal book return slot reached in and pulled out something unexpected: a small brass key wrapped in wax paper. The wax paper had a handwritten note: Box 712, do not lose. First assumptions. Library staff assumed it was a lost property key someone had accidentally dropped into the return slot. But when they called the numbers on their lost key procedure sheet, none matched the tag. It wasn't a library key. It wasn't a locker key from the building. It wasn't from any city department's known locks. The safety deposit connection. A circulation supervisor, curious, decided to check with nearby banks. On her third call, she hit Box 712 was an active safety deposit box at a small credit union 4 blocks from the library. The box was registered under the name Martin Lowell, a man in his 70s who had died in 2012. The account had been inactive for years, and under state law, the contents should have been turned over as unclaimed property. The unclaimed that was. When a representative from the credit union accompanied library staff to open box 712, they were expecting dusty papers or maybe a few old coins. Instead, inside the metal drawer was $18,000 in small bills, bundled with rubber bands. A driver's license for Martin Lowell that appeared to be a forgery. The photo was of a younger man, and the hologram strip was missing. A thin stack of index cards covered in tightly written names, numbers, and dates. The names. Some names on the cards had checks beside them, others were crossed out. When the library's branch manager saw one of the names, she froze. It was Patricia Delaney, a library volunteer who had died in 2010 after a brief illness. The date beside her name matched the day she'd last been in the building. Involving the police. Albany PD's Financial Crimes Unit took possession of the contents. A quick look at the names suggested many were deceased, and all had some connection to the library. Former staff, frequent patrons, or people from the library's literacy program. The working theory: someone had been keeping track of vulnerable individuals and possibly their personal information. The strange part: on the back of each index card was a short string of letters and numbers too short to be social security numbers, too random for phone numbers. One detective guessed they might be library card IDs, but when cross-referenced, they didn't match any in the system. And one more detail: the handwriting on the cards didn't match Martin Lowell's known signature, meaning someone else had been using his lockbox. Whoever that was, they'd kept the key hidden in the library itself, and if the renovation hadn't happened, it might have stayed there for years more. Detective Elaine Moritz from Albany PD took lead on the case. Her first step was to have every name on the index cards cross-referenced with public records. The results were unsettling. Of the 42 names, 31 were deceased. Of those, 19 had died within 6 months of their last recorded library visit. Nearly all of them were elderly or living alone, at the time of death. But the real kicker came from the coroner's archives. Several deaths had been noted as suspicious, but unproven. Minor thefts from their homes had been reported post-mortem, but no suspects had been identified. The code on the backs, the strings of letters and numbers on the backs of the cards, had stumped the initial team. It was a retired library cataloger, a volunteer, named Margaret Cho, who recognized the format. They weren't library card IDs, they were call numbers. Specifically, Dewey Decimal Call numbers for books in the Albany system. Why call numbers? Margaret noticed something else. Each call number corresponded to a different book, and each of those books had been checked out at some point by the person named on the front of the card. When Moritz had the books pulled from storage or off shelves, she found the next breadcrumb, faint pencil marks in the margins. Sometimes it was a check mark, sometimes a date, sometimes a single initial. The marks weren't consistent enough to form a clear message, but it was obvious they'd been deliberately added. The library visits pattern. Surveillance records from the years before Martin Lowell's death showed that his library card, still active long after his passing, had been used regularly by someone else, always to check out books matching the call numbers on the cards. It was as if someone was using the books themselves as a tracking or signaling system. The replacement card. Digging deeper, Moritz found that Lowell's original library card had been replaced in 2013 after being reported damaged. The replacement was issued in person at the downtown branch to a man who had provided Lowell's expired driver's license as ID. The staffer who processed it recalled the man as being in his 40s, well-dressed, the kind of person you don't remember unless you're told to. A suspect emerges. Security footage from that day was long since deleted, but a staff sign-in log for the computer terminals captured the man's login credentials, a temporary guest account linked to the email address Rochester Reads at protonmail.com. When cybercrimes traced activity from that account, they found logins at multiple libraries in upstate New York, each on days when suspicious withdrawals were made from the bank accounts of recently deceased patrons. The implication was clear. The lockbox, the index cards, the books, all were part of a methodical scheme to identify targets, communicate with accomplices, and collect proceeds. But the key question remained: who had inherited Martin Lowell's role in this, and how long had they been using the library as their personal hunting ground? Detective Elaine Moritz coordinated with state police and the U.S. Postal Inspection Service, the latter because many victims' identities had been used to reroute mail, giving thieves access to bank statements and personal documents. The plan was to flush out the active conspirator still using Lowell's system. Setting the bait. They picked a name from the index cards: Walter Yates, deceased 2016, and created a synthetic, revived identity in state records. The fake Yates had a small pension, a bank account, and a fresh library card added quietly into the Albany public library system. One of the bait moves was to check out a book whose call number matched one of the unsolved codes from the index cards, then return it to the downtown branch after hours. The returned book was fitted with a micro camera and tracking dust invisible under normal light. The hook. 3 days later, a man in a gray pea coat and knit cap retrieved the book from the shelf and carried it to a study carrel. He opened it, flipped to a page marked faintly in pencil, and took a photo with his phone before walking out. The tracker dust later showed up on the strap of a leather messenger bag found during his arrest. The man behind the pages. The suspect was identified as Douglas Keene, 46, a former part-time circulation clerk at a different Albany branch in the late 1990s. He had left under mutual agreement after accusations of rifling through lost and found items. Keene denied knowing Lowell, but admitted he'd heard of his system. Investigators believed Keene had taken over after Lowell's death, maintaining the network of codes and lockbox keys hidden in the library's infrastructure. The books, Moritz concluded, were a way to pass target information to accomplices without leaving obvious digital trails. The charges. Keene faced charges of identity theft, fraud, unlawful possession of personal identification, and conspiracy. But prosecutors struggled to tie him to the earlier deaths linked to the index card names. There was no direct evidence he'd harmed anyone physically. He took a plea deal, 8 years in state prison and forfeiture of $142,000 in seized assets. The quiet sweep. In the months after Keene's arrest, Albany Public Library staff quietly inspected every branch for hidden items. They found a hollowed-out encyclopedia containing 3 spare safety deposit keys, a manila envelope taped under the basement stairs with a new list of names and call numbers, a plastic microfilm canister with a handwritten label, backups. Reflection. For the library staff, the most unsettling part wasn't that the building had been used as a meeting point for criminals. It was the idea that something as benign as a shelf of books, the same books patrons had handled for years, had been turned into a private signal system for a theft ring. Moritz still visits the downtown branch occasionally. Not to check out books, but to walk the stacks, glance at the spines, and wonder how many marks she doesn't see and whether someone else is already learning to read them.